Hello, welcome to the channel, or welcome back. Over the series of videos that I've been releasing, I have received a number of comments or questions asking how to do certain specific things, how to build EAs in a certain way, how to trade in specific ways. And some of those I've answered directly in the comments, some are still waiting for answers. What I've decided to do is create this series of videos, which I'm calling the By Request, where I'm going to actually create videos to show how to do all of those things that have been requested. I thought that to do that, though, I would want to create a good quality object-oriented framework. So the first few videos in this series are actually building a framework, and once that's done, then I can begin to answer the By Request questions using that framework. Now, if you're uncertain what a framework is, it's basically a set of building blocks, and it will make it much easier to create expert advisors in the future by being able to pull together pieces of those, or by being able to pull together pieces of that framework, string them together like Lego blocks, and then create working EAs with minimum effort. And also, as the framework evolves, it will include more and more features, making more and more powerful EAs. As I build the framework out in this and the coming videos, I'll build it out as a minimal framework and then add to it as needed to answer the questions that you're asking. So don't expect that initially I'm going to create a very heavyweight and difficult to understand framework. Everything will be simple and the bare minimum needed to run working expert advisors. Having said that, I'll be releasing 3 videos covering the initial base framework, and then the 4th video will actually get onto making an expert advisor. So in the first video, I create a basic expert class that can be used by the framework, and at the end of this, the expert template that I'll build will be able to be compiled, but because I haven't built any of the trading capabilities yet, it won't do anything. But the code is valid and everything will compile. And then in the future 2 installments in this series, I'll create the ability to execute trades and to handle signals from various indicators. So I hope this is something that's going to be useful to you. Keep watching and coming back for the future videos. And if you have a question that you haven't already asked, then either leave a comment below the video, or you can follow the link that I've included in the description to the video, where I've set up a request page that you can leave specific requests. I'm going to start by creating an EA in MetaTrader 4 using the wizard, and that EA will become the template that I will use then for creating specific expert advisors in the future. So I've already got a folder here called Framework EA underneath my Orchard folder. I'm just going to right click that and select New File, and then I get the wizard. I won't add any inputs at this point, and now I'm going to select all of the checkboxes that aren't grayed out. And I'm doing that just so that I get all of the possible event handlers included in my expert. And there's the basic expert created. I'm just going to do a little reformatting to clean this up. Now I'm going to add in the elements that I want to use in my framework. So first, in the template, of course, there are going to be some inputs. I've left a section here to add those inputs directly, and I've already included the inputs that I normally add, which would be the trading volume, a trade comment, and the magic number. My intent with the framework is that I have a class for an expert, and I call that expert to do all of the heavy lifting rather than do the work inside the EA itself. So I'm going to need an object of type expert. So let me just declare that. So I'm defining the expert as CExpert base, and when we get to building the framework, I'll actually create the CExpert base class. And the reason I'm using this define statement is that if I want to override the expert base in some way, then all I need to do is change this define statement, and everything else will still be using CExpert as whatever class name I've assigned. So then I'm just declaring a variable of type CExpert base. It's a pointer. I'm just calling that expert, which I'll then use throughout the code. Next, in the on init section, this event set timer was created by the wizard, but I'm going to remove that, because if there is going to be a timer set, I'll set that inside the expert class. and then I need to create an instance of the expert. So this is simple. Expert equals new CExpert. So when I create the CExpert base class, I'll have to make sure that I have a constructor that takes no arguments. Then there are going to be some standard variables that I'm going to need to assign to the expert. So I'm going to be creating methods inside the expert class. I need to set the volume from the input above, the comment, and the magic number. So those will be used in all of the trade transactions the expert executes. Next, the expert is going to need to get signals to know when and how to trade. I haven't created the signals yet, but I'm setting up a comment here to indicate where that would happen. And then once all of that's been done, I just need to check that the expert is working correctly. And I'm going to call the onInit method of the expert, mirroring the onInit method here, and get that result back. And then by returning result, that takes care of the initialization section of the expert advisor. So next, in the onDinit section, I'll leave the event kill timer statement there. If no timer has been set, this won't hurt. And if it has been set and not removed by the expert class, then again, it won't hurt. This will be useful to remove that timer. The one thing I do want to add here, though, is to delete the expert object that was created above. Then to the onTick section, and this is very easy. I'm just going to create a method inside the expert class that duplicates the signature of this onTick, and that's where all of the onTick work will happen. Then I'll do the same with onTimer. I'll just create a method inside the class that duplicates onTimer. In the onTester, again, I'm going to duplicate this for the expert, but here, because it's a type double, not a void, I actually need to return the value, so that onTester method, when I create it inside the expert, will be of type double. And then in onChartEvent, same thing again, but here I need to pass in all of the arguments that were received by the onChartEvent. Now that's the MQL4 version of the expert created. As I said, this is a template that I'll then use to create real experts in the future, and of course it doesn't work yet because I haven't created the framework. What I'll do next is create the same thing for MQL5. It's very similar, so I'll go through that very quickly. Alright, I've got my MQL5 editor open now. It can see the MQ4, but I'm not going to be using that here. I'm just going to go through the wizard, new file, still not specifying any input parameters here. And this is the main difference between the MQL5 and the MQL4 template. There are more options to check in here. So I'm just going to turn everything on. And this is my MQL5 framework created. I'll do some reformatting. So I've done the reformatting here, and I've already put in the information that I added for the MQL4 version. So the same inputs, the volume, comment, and magic number. Still declaring an expert, doing exactly the same thing here. onInit, new expert, everything the same. And as we get down to some of the event handlers that don't exist in MQL4, you see I'm also doing the same thing. I'm simply duplicating the function name inside the expert class. And I've just done that all the way through. So the templates are now created for both the MQL5 and the MQL4 version, and it's time to move on to create the framework. Now back in the MQL4 editor, where I'll do most of the work, and I need to create the framework. So I've already got a frameworks folder inside my Orchard folder. I want to number my frameworks so that as I go forward and make revisions, I can create new versions. So I'm going to create a folder inside frameworks. I'm just going to call framework 1.0. Now inside here, first I'm going to create my common base class. You might have seen me use this class before. This is very similar to the ones that I've used in the past. It just holds the standard information of symbol and time frame. So create a new file. That's created by the wizard. Now let me start tidying that up and putting my information in. All right, this is my common base class. I've just tidied up the heading here. Class name C common base. I have some member variables being primarily the symbol and the time frame. And I'm also setting the number of digits for the symbol. I'll set that up when the initialization happens for the class because that's used commonly. Then you may have also seen previously I set up an init message and an init result. I'm going to use those during the initialization of classes to determine whether the initialization was successful or not. And that way I have a common routine within the common base class for handling initialization errors. The constructors then for the base class. First I've got the empty constructor, just C common base with no arguments. And then I'll simply call the init function, which is defined a little further down, passing in the current symbol from the chart and the current period from the chart. So this is the default constructor. Then I'm allowing a constructor where I override the symbol, because sometimes you might be running an EA but have a specific symbol that it needs to run on. So I'll pass in a symbol name, and in that case I'm initializing with the symbol passed in and still the default period. Then I have a constructor where I'm specifying a time frame in case you might be running on one chart but trying to run your EA for a different time frame, and that takes the default symbol and passes in the time frame. And I have two of these, one that is an integer because typically the time frame you would be passing in might be the period value, and those are integers, but I want to convert that to an enum time frame. So in this constructor where I'm passing in an integer, I'm just casting that to an enum time frame and calling the init function, which would be the same init function as this. Then the final two constructors where you're passing in both the symbol and the time frame. Again here, passing in the time frame as an integer, which I'm casting to an enum time frame, and in the final constructor calling with the time frame and the symbol passed in. The destructors, common base, there's nothing to do here, so I've just got the two empty brackets. And then the init function, which is called from all of these constructors, and that takes a symbol and a time frame. Now I mentioned the init error function, so this can be called from any of the classes that inherit from this class. Pass in an init message and an init result. And then it simply assigns that message and result to the two member variables that I had defined above, and it then returns the init result. I know this is being passed in. This just makes it so that I can write in my code and return the value at the same time as calling this method. You'll see that when I start to use it in classes later. Finally, the two properties. I have two properties of init result and init message that simply return those member variables. And then I've added one function here for trade allowed. In MQL4 there is a function called isTradeAllowed, and in MQL5 that function is removed and been replaced by calls to symbol info integer. So I've just created one function that I call trade allowed. The same function that exists in MQL5 can be used in MQL4, but it was a little bit lengthy. So rather than have this throughout my code, I've just created this one function, trade allowed, that I can call at any time. Now the init function that's being called from the constructors takes a symbol and a time frame, and here you can see I'm calling init error with no message and succeeded, so I'm really just setting that up as a success to begin with, simply assigning the symbol and the time frame, and then I'm assigning this mDigits variable with the result of symbol info integer cast to an int because it comes back as a long, passing in symbol and symbol digits to the symbol info integer function, and then returning init succeeded because nothing has happened in here that can cause that to fail. And that's all of the common base class, which I will use in many instances of child classes. Now I'm creating the expert base class, and this is the one that was referenced from the template here. So I just created an empty class to begin with. This class is going to inherit from common base. So the first thing I need to do is include the common base in here. Now I'm using the quoted include rather than the angle brackets. If you look at the navigator here, my expert base is in the same folder as common base, and that's the way I plan to maintain the structure inside each framework. So expert base can directly reference common base without using the angle brackets. And by referencing it in this way, I don't need to worry about which version of the framework this is stored in. If I use the angle brackets, I would have to include the full path down through Orchard Frameworks Framework 1.0, which means I would need to know the path name here. By using the quoted reference, which is relative to the location of this file, then I can just call it as common base. So then this obviously needs to inherit. So the expert base class will now inherit all of those functions and features from common base. Two common values that an expert would have would be a magic number and a trade comment. They get applied to every trade that's executed. So I'm going to maintain member variables for those two. I'm also going to have a member variable for the volume. Now, there will be some expert advisors that take a fixed volume, and some may calculate the volume based on risk levels. So this may be treated a little differently, but for the time being, I'm just going to maintain a single volume number here. And then to handle trading when it's a new bar or on every instance, I'm going to create variables to hold the last bar time and the current bar time. And those are all of my protected member variables. Now remembering, protected member variables can be seen and used by classes that inherit from this class, where private member variables would be visible only inside this class. So I'm making these protected, and that way in future, if I have a need for a specific expert class that inherits from this, it has access to these values. And now I have a protected function, and I'm using the keyword protected again because I'm just separating the functions from the variables. It doesn't really add any value to the code. I just find it more readable. So now I'm declaring a Boolean function loop main. I'm going to be calling this in the event handler for onTick. I've declared it as virtual so that subclasses of expert base can either use this function directly, or they can implement their own version of loop main and override this. Next, in the public section, I have the constructors. I have several constructors. The default constructor, which calls cCommonBase with no arguments, so that will initialize with the current chart symbol and time frame. And then I'm calling my init function, which I haven't declared yet, passing a 0 and no string. So that's the magic number holder, or that's the place for the magic number, and this is the trade comment. So if you call cExpertBase with no values, it will initiate with magic number 0 and no trade comment. And then the alternatives. First, the expert base constructor that takes a symbol, time frame, magic number, and comment. So then I call the common base past the symbol and time frame, and then call the initialization function here using the magic number and the comment. This is also one of those functions that takes the integer as the time frame, and I duplicated this using the enum time frames so that I can then call common base with symbol and time frame, and again init using magic number and trade comment. And finally, if you're just using the default symbol and time frame, which would be most cases, there's a constructor that just takes magic number and trade comment, calling cCommonBase with no values, and then initializing with the magic number and trade comment. The init function I'm going to add here in the protected section so that it can't be called directly by an application, but it can be called by subclasses. Just taking the magic number and the trade comment. Now I have constructors. I need to create a destructor for this, and I'll fill in the detail for that below. And now I'm going to create some public property functions. So here I have specific functions to set the volume, the trade comment, and the magic number. So volume I have specifically excluded from the constructors, but trade comment and magic number can be left out of the constructor if you just use the default constructor here. So I've created methods to set them later, And all these do is assign the passed in value to the appropriate member variable. Now, all of those events that are in the expert advisor here, these on tick, on timer, I need to create the matching methods inside the expert for those. So I simply duplicate them. These are also virtual, so that any subclass inheriting from this can override these. So on init, there really is just the call to init result, which is the C common base method, and that just returns. On tick, I have an implementation of that further down in the class. On timer, I'm not using at the moment in the framework, so I'm just returning from that. Same with on tester, I'm just returning a 0 value because it's a double. And on chart event also, nothing here. Now, there are also the methods that I added for MQL5 in the MQL5 Expert Advisor. So the methods here, like on tester init, on tester pass, they don't exist for MQL4. So inside the class, I've wrapped the matching functions for those inside this ifdef MQL5. When the compiler runs, there are two specific values set as macros. Double underscore MQL5 double underscore is set if this is being compiled for MQL5, and if it's being compiled for MQL4, then there's a double underscore MQL4 double underscore macro defined. So this statement, ifdef double underscore MQL5 double underscore, means that this block of code is only compiled if I'm using the MQL5 compiler. And because these functions can't be called from MQL4, I've put them in here, and that was mainly because these structures, as used in the onTrade transaction function, don't exist for MQL4. But at the moment, I still don't have any work to be done in these, so they're all defined with default values. They're all virtuals, so that they can be overridden by a child class if needed. But for the time being, nothing's happening in any of these. Now, some of the implementations. The destructor, cExpert base, nothing to happen here, but I have left a function so that as the framework grows and evolves later, I can put something in here if it's needed. And then the init function that does most of the work when the class is instantiated, takes the magic number, trade comment. First thing I'm doing is checking this. If init result is not succeeded, then I'm going to return init result. That handles cases where the parent class has failed the initialization and it has used that init result function within the common base to set an error condition, and this will simply prevent the initialization going any further. And then all I'm doing is assigning the magic number and trade comment to their relevant variables and setting the last bar time to 0. So when that cycle comes through and looks to see if we have a new bar, on the first run through I'm always going to have a new bar because I've set the time to 0. And then finally, because I'm not going to get any errors inside this section, I'm just returning init succeeded. Then the only event handler that I've initiated in, or that I've created in here, is the onTick. First I'm checking if trade is not allowed. So if not trade allowed, that's the function from common base, then return. So I'm simply looping through until trading is allowed. This is to handle any event such as the times of day where brokers shut down. So many brokers have a certain few minutes of each day where ticks are still happening, and so your expert advisor is still being called, but the broker isn't accepting any transactions. So I build this in, and during those times trading's not allowed, and it simply exits this function and keeps cycling around. And here I'm getting the current bar time using the iTime function, and I'm using that to determine whether I'm in a new bar or not. So I'm setting two variables. The first time, which is going to be true if last bar time is 0, which you'll remember we set above. So when the expert runs for the first time, then first time is going to be true. And the new bar variable that simply checks to see whether the current bar time that's just created is the same as the member variable last bar time. And if it's different, then new bar is true. And I'm calculating those two values because I then pass those into the loop main function that you'll see we defined above. And loop main is a Boolean function, so if that returns true, meaning it was successful, then I'm setting last bar time to the current bar time, which means that next time through this won't be a new bar. So by returning false from loop main, I'm able to force this to run again, and that might be if there's some condition that causes loop main to exit early, and I actually want to run again rather than skip until the next bar. And then the loop main function itself, the new bar and the first time variables, and simple conditions here because initially in the framework I'm only going to trade once per bar. So if this is not a new bar, then I'm just going to return, and I'm returning true so that will be reset as I said here. And if this is first time, I also don't want to process. So that might be something you want to do differently, but if I'm trading on a long time frame and I start the expert toward the end of the bar, I don't necessarily want to process immediately. So this will mean that I never process during the bar that's currently open when the expert is started. And then I haven't got any implementation here yet, but there'll be a section here for any trades that should be closed and another section for trades that should be opened. Now I'm not implementing those right now because it would make this quite a lengthy video. So they will come in parts 2 and 3 of this series. Now to tie all of this together, plus any of the components that will be created as we go through the later stages of building this, I'm going to create a single include file. I'm going to put it inside this frameworks folder. Now this is the file I've created. I've put it inside the frameworks folder, not inside the framework 1.0 folder. I've named it framework 1.0, and as I create more versions, I will simply create more copies of this named with framework_version number, all in the frameworks folder. And you can see then inside this file, all I've done is do some includes. And those includes are the framework 1.0 folder, common base, and expert base. There will be more of these as I build out the framework further. And then to use that framework, let me go back to the EA template that we built. If I go to the beginning here, just before the inputs, I put this one statement. So I'm including that framework 1.0.mqh file here, and that pulls in all of the rest of the framework. Now at the moment we don't have very much in the framework, trying to keep the videos short, but this framework include file will build out to include everything that we need for a fully working framework. I'm going to take this little section of code also and put this into the MQL5 template. Now I'll go back and just make sure that my MQL4 compiles. It does. And the MQL5, make sure that compiles. And it does. So obviously at the moment this won't trade. We haven't built in any of the signals to perform trading or any of the functions capable of trading. But this is the beginning of the framework, and in the next installment here I will build the signal capabilities, and then we'll move on to build the trading capabilities, and then begin actually developing some real expert advisors that use this framework. And as we build more and more expert advisors, the framework itself will grow as I need to add more and more features to that. So I hope this is useful to you, and if there are any things that you would like included in this by request series, so if there are any particular strategies you'd like to see built or just features you'd like to see created, leave comments or go to our website and leave a request there. I have created a specific contact form for by request requests, and I put a link to that in the description below the video. So go there and leave the detail that you would like me to cover. They may not be covered quickly because I am trying to make sure that this series builds on each of the prior installments. So if there's something that looks like it will benefit from the work done by another request, yours may wait a little while, but I will try to get through all of the requests that I receive. If you are finding these videos useful, then please leave a like, and if you want to be informed when we release the further parts of this, then click the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive a notification. So until the next time, thank you for watching.